On this episode, we're going to be discussing litigation and all of the different facets. I am not an expert in litigation, so I'm hoping that my guest here is going to be able to walk me through. But I think from the standpoint of the listener, you heard litigation. Don't shut off your podcast because Laura is actually quite quite instructive on litigation, and we're going to tie this all back into insurance because that's her expertise. So Laura Gregory is my guest for this particular episode. Laura, welcome.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Laura is a partner at the law firm of Sloan and Walsh in Boston. She is also an author, featured as an author of a book called #Networked: How 20 Women Lawyers Overcame the Confines of COVID-19 Social Distancing to Create Connections, Cultivate Community, and Build Businesses in the Midst of a Global Pandemic. There's the book. And she's very active on LinkedIn, so we will definitively put her connection link in the show notes. But when you go in LinkedIn, just search #Laura Has It Covered, and you're gonna get your quasi law degree on that. What do they call that when they give a degree to someone who didn't deserve it?
Oh, what is that called? Honorary
An
degree.
honorary. You'll get your honorary degree from #Laura if you go to #Laura Has It Covered. So Laura, again, welcome. I always start off all of these podcasts with the elevator pitch. Why don't you give a better description than I did? Who are you and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
All right, well, first of all, back to what you said about litigation. One of the things that I do is try and keep my clients out of litigation or minimize litigation. And there are a lot of ways to do that. If you're an insurance company, you're going to be involved in litigation. It's unfortunately, I think, a reality these days, but there are ways to minimize it and to minimize the exposure if you are in litigation. My day-to-day, I am entirely, my practice is entirely insurance coverage and bad faith. I do first and third party, commercial and personal lines, variety of different coverages over my nearly 30-year career now. And all of the bad faith claims that are related to that, which is a ever-changing landscape. And COVID has certainly been no stranger to that. We've seen probably the most notorious has been the business interruption claims, which are sort of coverages that no one had paid attention to much before this. And now we've seen them on the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and have more law on that in the last year than probably the sum of business interruption law to date. So a lot of stuff has been happening. I like coverage because it makes you think, and every case is different. No matter how well you know the policies, the facts are always different, and there are creative ways to look at things, sort of good and bad. And I like that real, more academic sense of the analysis, which is why most people don't like it. So it's a good fit for me.
Yeah.
I have been at Sloan and Walsh about 25 years now, and we do litigation in all different types of insurance defense and coverage and bad faith in New England and nationally. And I, in my free time, am also on the select board in Andover, Massachusetts, which is a New England oddity that I grew up in the Midwest and didn't know about until I moved out here, but I sort of analogize it to the board of directors of a corporation. We are in charge, but we have a CEO, which is our town manager, who runs the day-to-day, and we hire or fire him or her. And then there are a number of other appointments that we have, but we're the policymakers and we're the sort of ultimate deciders of the things that are not legislative, which is done by town meeting, which is our residents that come out on a particular day and vote. It's very interesting phenomenon. So I was a political science major in college, so it's been very intriguing to learn about this new government that I wasn't aware of.
How many terms have you served?
I'm in my second term. I actually was reelected during COVID, so which was interesting. I was the chair of the board coming into COVID, and then I was supposed to have my election in March of 2020, which didn't happen as scheduled. And instead, it happened in June with mail-in ballots, which we hadn't been able to do before that, and many different changes. And then I continued on as chair into the beginning of August. So it was a exciting time to be involved in local government, not necessarily in a good way, but a lot of things that got done. And I think we handled it as well as we could in the circumstances. So
Yeah.
hopefully we can come out of this soon.
How many
Never
books how
imagined.
many books do you think will come out about all of this COVID craze
I
and
don't
some
know.
of the behind the scenes stuff? Because I bet like even someone in your situation, like I bet like you saw governmental action at the local level. Like excuse my French, but I bet you saw some shit.
It was frustrating, and some, like, for example, we are subject to the open meeting law, which means that ordinarily we can only meet in person. We can only meet with 48 hours notice unless it's an emergency. And so until the law allowed us to meet virtually, we had to meet in person. So we had to figure out
How to change the
how
law?
we could meet, inside, far enough apart. And back,
Wow.
in March of last year, we hadn't figured out what we were doing at that point. You weren't supposed to wear a mask, and we didn't know how many people to have in a room. And so it was very interesting trying to figure out how to do that. Now we've been meeting virtually for, I imagine we're approaching a year now. Um, and it's convenient to do it from your house, but it is a very different experience. And I think we don't get as much input from our residents as we would with an
Mhm.
in-person meeting where somebody could attend. They can call in either on the phone, or they can get, a Zoom link in, or they can email us. So there are all these different ways they can get the information in, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
So
Because I
hopefully
know a
we'll be
lot of
back to that.
I grew up the street in Haverhill, so I'm a
Mm,
Merrimack Valley person,
excellent.
born and bred, and so I'm very and I worked at my first insurance gig was in Andover, right in downtown, right on Route 28. So I'm very familiar with
Nice.
Andover. Phillips Academy was one of my accounts that I got to work on. So know the community well. And what people who are listening to this might not understand about like some of the local New England town politics, and it's probably the same out in other parts of the country, but like a lot of the local people take that very seriously, and you get a lot of them are repeat attendees. Like
Oh,
they show
definitely.
up at every meeting and they speak at every meeting. They have stuff to say, and they want to make sure that they have opinions and very strong ones about a lot of the stuff that including like where to put the stop sign type of thing.
And a number of those people, at least in Andover, are of the older age groups. So they've been particularly, understandably so, unwilling to come out to things. So, I look forward to a time when we can hear from all those individuals again, because they've been pretty quiet for the last
Yeah,
year.
yeah.
Um,
Well, let's jump into litigation in your specialty. We were on a panel, so you brought up COVID. That was the big part of the conversation we had on our panel, talking about the pandemic. So you just talked about how it influenced you on the town government side, but your bread and butter litigation. Can you talk about what the pandemic has done on that side? And could you start as well by level setting bad faith, just for anyone that's listening that doesn't understand the
oh, sure.
implications? of bad
Um,
faith, but then go into what that meant for COVID and the pandemic and, business interruption and all of those things.
so bad faith is sort of the, I don't know, almost insurance slang for uh, for essentially the absence of good faith is where the label comes from, but it's extra contractual. So it's not just payments under the policy, it's additional payments that an insurance company would have to make because they didn't do something that they were supposed to do, or they did something that they shouldn't have done with regard to generally a claim. Um, and it varies state to state, like all things insurance. Some states, I would say most states, have a Unfair Claims Practices Act that at least impacts on the bad faith law in the state. Many states, like Massachusetts, you can make a direct claim under that statute, saying that the insurance company violated the parameters of the statute. Other states, only the commissioner of insurance can make those claims, but in most of those states, there's also case law that provides a way to get there. So the short answer is almost every state, I think every state, has some way that a insured, and oftentimes a claimant, if it's a liability policy, can make a claim against an insurance company for mishandling a claim.
Yeah, and that can be anything from you didn't pay what you were supposed to, or you didn't pay me enough.
Or
Like,
you didn't pay it fast enough.
or you didn't pay fast
Um,
enough. Yeah. Like, yeah.
um, or you didn't send a letter about your rights at a certain time, or you didn't include every right and now you want to rely on something later.
Yeah.
A lot of different bases, and those claims do vary state to state, but they can be very substantial.
Right.
In Massachusetts, if you prove a violation of our statutory program, you can get triple damages if it's proved to be willful, and the insured or the plaintiff can get their attorney's fees as well. And that's in addition to what they would be entitled to under the policy. So it can potentially be big money. Every once in a while, we see a case where you have, a $4 or $5 million judgment that gets tripled, and then you add attorney's fees on it. So it can be ugly.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's thrown in as sort of a kitchen sink approach, that everybody makes a claim for bad faith, and awful lot of them, there's nothing really there. But every once in a while, there's a big problem.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something to be concerned about.
Yeah. So from the COVID standpoint, um, there were so we have a lot of issues, right? So predominantly around business interruption, COVID causes governments to shut stuff down, businesses can't do stuff, and creative people are looking at those insurance policies and say, I have business interruption coverage over there, and I bet I could find a way to get coverage, including that, hey, you didn't move fast, like you said, you didn't move fast enough, or you denied me something that you shouldn't deny me. Can you talk about the landscape around what COVID did I think it's predominantly commercial insurance. I don't know if you saw anything on the personal line side, but it was definitively a mess.
Well, business interruption definitely is just the commercial side, and I think that for anybody who doesn't understand what business interruption is, it's basically in very specific circumstances, a business, if they have purchased the coverage, can get some portion of essentially the profits that they would have had they been operating correctly. And they may also, depending on what kind of coverage they get some coverage for extra expenses that they had as a result of whatever the problem is. And the problem is generally requires direct physical loss, either to the premises or within the vicinity of the premises, again, depending on which coverage you have. And the problem with the cases involving COVID is you have to have direct physical loss. And direct physical loss Generally, that's something like, okay, you're a restaurant owner and a tree falls on your restaurant and you're not able to operate your restaurant, or your building catches fire and you have to shut down and rebuild. Um, those sorts of situations, there's no question there's direct physical loss. If stuff is burning up, it's directly physically damaged. If a tree falls on it, there's direct physical loss. If there is an allegation that a virus is present in the air, almost all the courts, don't think I can say all, but almost all the courts have determined so far that the presence of COVID is not direct physical loss. So a number of these policies also have virus exclusions, which of course was a big problem because COVID is caused by the coronavirus, which shockingly is a virus.
Yep.
So the courts have been determining almost entirely that there's no coverage for these, which is, in my opinion, appropriate under the terms of the policy, but it's a terrible situation for these businesses. And me, with my elected official hat on, we're doing everything we can to support our local restaurants, including me going out for takeout a lot more than I used to.
Me too.
And trying to find ways that the government can support them and things like that. And they're in a terrible position, and we know that a lot of these businesses are not going to survive, and it's awful. But that doesn't change the contract that is the insurance policy. So I think the determinations have been correct, but they've been painful. And people didn't really understand this coverage, so that makes it even more difficult. Hopefully people will have a better understanding of how this coverage works by virtue of it having been in the news and those sorts of things.
Do you think there's a possibility? I brought this up in on LinkedIn and some tweets on social media, but it's been a little while. There's some creative, smart people that work on the plaintiff side. They'll find things, and oftentimes we shoot ourselves in the foot as insurers, like we ambiguous policy language and all of that, but they're very creative. And I made a suggestion that just given my background in commercial insurance, I know the intent was not to cover this. Right, the virus exclusions have been around for over a decade, right? And they came about based off of other litigation that occurred that could have been virus or bacterial mold related. So they all kind of got lumped together. And it's
my understanding that when we had the SARS problem of, I don't know how long ago was that, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, when there was that really kicked the exclusions into overdrive, that companies realized that they didn't want to cover those sorts of things.
Because they're not charging for it.
And right? It's a whole different risk. It's
completely.
It's the equivalent of having a hurricane hit the whole country all at the same time.
It's not understood. And I think the intention was always not to cover it. And so those exclusions were meant to cover any ambiguous language that could give plaintiff's lawyer kind of an open door to, hey, there's some coverage here. But that's what we get taught when we take, continuing ed classes, is that this, when I first heard of it, I'm like, of course it's not covered. Like I learned that in CPCU class, like this is the kind of thing that's not covered. And I almost saw it as a vehicle from what you described in your prior answer was that there might be an E&O option. Do you think there's any opportunity now for these companies to get the quick no, right? Or to kind of find money, see that door close, and then go to their brokers and say, you should have told us this. Like, we didn't understand this. Do you think there's a door there?
I don't know if it's a successful door, but I think there's going to be litigation there. There already is claims about it. And in most states, in order to make a claim against, for an insured to make a claim against their agent successfully, they have to prove a special relationship with the agent, which is generally a pretty high hurdle. it has to be, they have to really function more like a risk manager and really have gotten to know your business and usually over a period of time, and to understand the risks and to have a continuing relationship. And I'm not saying that those relationships don't exist. They certainly do. But I find, at least in the cases that we see, that it is more unusual than not. Um,
How about in situations like brokers like Marsh, Aon, Gallagher, where um, you know, that's kind of their thing is big corporate type of commercial insurance with, I've been at the Marsh and the Aons, and I've been at the agencies, and
yeah.
it's a different thing. I would say that the Marshes are almost like trying to sell that, hey, because we're a broker, we represent you, not the companies. Does that teeter at all?
I think that that can be it. I think a lot of times when, especially if you're talking about a big insured, that they'll have a risk manager that is the one that makes more of the decisions or advises the company on the decisions than the broker does. Um, Obviously, it depends a lot, and I can't also represent that every state is like that, but a number of states do require that. And that's going to be a question of fact in every single case. What is the relationship between them? What was the expectation? Was that reasonable? Going through
Yeah.
like the communications. Having said that, I think we can probably say across the board that everybody could have done a better job explaining to insureds business interruption coverage. Um,
as one of
both,
my as one of my colleagues explains it to me, she always says, Nick, there's never any harm in over communicating. So
um, I think that also a lot of insureds that didn't have this coverage, whether they chose not to or whether they didn't know it existed, are now aware of the risk in a new and horrible way. But it's a risk that now people can understand better. And so I think that helps this to be an easier conversation for businesses to understand, because even if they were a lucky type of business that was able to even thrive in COVID, say they were making laptops for elementary school students or something, they probably did well. But they can understand that something could happen that they have no control of that could greatly impact on their business, and that's a exposure that they may want to consider paying a premium to get some coverage if that should happen.
yeah, and that was on the panel that we participated in. That's what I brought up, was that's what I'm seeing is this is it well beyond COVID. This business interruption is finally, I think, been raised to a high enough level that I think we tried to do on at the brokerage. When I think significant brokers try to have serious discussions about business interruption, but it doesn't happen often enough, especially in this way, to open people's eyes
Yeah. The
to it.
civil
And now it's
authority,
on
I think
everyone's
in
agenda.
particular. I think the civil authority particularly, because, people couldn't imagine a situation where it was likely that they were going to be
Yeah,
shut down for a significant amount of time by some government order. We can certainly understand that now.
yeah.
Um,
What
I
is the?
also had
Oh,
just
go ahead.
seen today that the New Jersey legislature passed a bill that is being sent to the governor for signature that would require notification of insureds about business interruption not covering pandemics. Um, so that's interesting. We've had a number of legislative bills that were essentially trying to create coverage retroactively for these events that, at least to my knowledge, none of them have passed. Um, but New Jersey is, I would guess, likely to now have a notification type situation with business interruption. I believe Louisiana has one as well. So there may be some more activity in providing information to insureds that's required
Yeah.
Certainly, I hope that it's done regardless of whether it's required, because it can only help everybody.
You think there are any good odds that any of these states retroactively find coverage?
Well, I always hesitate to, guess at what a legislature would do. I'm an elected official. I understand there's pressure to provide for these businesses that are hurting, but the fact that none of these have passed yet, and New Jersey, in fact, had one of the earliest ones that was supposed to go to the floor for discussion back, I think April maybe of last year. And it died, never made it. It came out of committee and was never seen again. I think that people have realized that they're just going to end up with a lot of litigation. There are constitutional issues, which
Yeah.
insurance coverage lawyers don't deal with constitutional issues often. So that's sort of been a new and interesting one. But to change a contract after the fact, to change its application without a implication as to premium or anything, would be catastrophic for the insurance industry. But and just not good contract law.
Yeah.
I don't see it being successful, and the insurance companies are going to fight it because their cost, if they don't, is enormous.
It would be
So
existential for a lot of them.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's going to end up in litigation, and I think that maybe that message has gotten across. We'll see. There's still a bunch of those bills out there, so it could happen.
Yeah. How has this affected other litigation? So you humorously discussed the challenges it took to get a local government online and to be able to have things. So courts got the same problems,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm assuming that did very little to increase efficiency in getting these things processed. So how how are the current set of court cases now? And I'm looking at my notes too. I kind of giggled at my own little thing, like because of the Suez Canal ship. I'm like, does this create a Suez Canal ship?
Now, did you see my post yesterday? Was about the Suez Canal and the
No,
insurance implications.
no, but that's kind of ironic, right? Like we could have our own little problem here where COVID in my imagination, I like these, like we got to get through the backlog. Like
Yeah.
this could extend out indefinitely and create a backlog problem just like that ship. Do you think
Well,
that will happen?
I mean, that's already happening. The civil courts have been doing very little. So essentially, when you're looking at a court system, criminal is going to have priority over civil every single time, as it should. And there are different constitutional requirements for essentially physical presence in the criminal context. So what we've seen is a lot of courts have done well with things that aren't trials. For example, most of my practice, not all, but a lot of my cases are decided on summary judgment or maybe even motions to dismiss, as we've seen with the business interruption cases. And those are file your brief and make your argument to the judge. And those have mostly been done by Zoom or the equivalent. And I think they've done well. And part of the reason a lot of these business interruption decisions came out is because they could be done that way. Now, cases that have to go to trial, like all of those bread and butter defense cases that insurance companies have, a lot of those would require a trial if they go all the way forward. I know in Massachusetts state courts, we're looking at cases that were supposed to be on April of this year are getting pushed off at least a year. And the judges are saying that year is really just a guideline and that it's going to get pushed out farther.
Mm-hmm.
I think mediation has done well. I was dubious about mediation via Zoom. I felt like that a lot of cases you just really need all the personalities, together and not being distracted. It's actually done really well. I've settled a bunch of cases through Zoom mediation. I've settled a bunch of cases without mediation. Insurance companies, in my experience, have been eager to settle cases, to get them done, to get them off their books in situations where it makes sense. Obviously, not every case makes sense. But when you're also looking at states where your interest is running on any potential judgment, that adds to it as well. So it's sitting on the books of the insurance company for, say, an extra year or two more than they had anticipated. Massachusetts, simple interest on a tort case is 12% per year.
Wow.
Yeah, from the date of filing of the suit. So Rhode Island, it's 12% per year from the date of the accident.
So
So that can add up really fast.
yeah. And that would be very much counter to anyone, because as you were describing the backlog, I'm thinking, oh, it'd be advantageous, right, for someone that's being sued to have it kind of drag out. People would, might get antsy and they might be the first ones to try to settle quickly. But for the one that's getting sued, it could, if the judgment goes against them, it's quite painful, because that extra time is money. And
Yeah.
specifically in that case, that delay is killing them, figuratively.
So there, a lot of things there. The other thing is, what a trial's going to look like. Are we comfortable with having a Zoom trial? Massachusetts, they're basically in the state court switching to 6-person juries, which defense attorneys aren't too happy about. And we're trying to figure out whether we have a constitutional defense to that or not. These are all issues that no one has dealt with before. If you have a jury in person, then how do you have people 6 feet apart? Do you require witnesses to take their masks off while they're testifying? What if they aren't comfortable with that? How is your jury pool different? Because depending on the state of, say, vaccines, you may have different groups that are overly represented or underrepresented. From what I understand, the numbers of, like, the percentage of people that show up for jury duty that are called are extremely down. So getting a jury for an in-person trial is going to be a challenge, and it's going to be a different jury. And how has COVID affected it? Do people have different views on, say, medical establishments than they did before this? Or maybe Big Pharma has gotten a makeover in light of the fact that they created these vaccines that were, at least I'm eager to get. So a lot of different things that are all being thrown together, and it's going to be difficult to predict how those are going to play out.
Wow. And so I wanted to get into attorney performance and how insurers can sort of gauge how litigation is going for them, how their attorneys are performing. But this adds a wrinkle to that, right, as well. Like, this sort of changes the dynamic around that, where, I mean, you could do all the right things, and just because of the new normal that we're in, get a completely different outcome, even if you did it perfectly.
Well, I mean, juries are always a guessing game. You never know what you're going to get from a jury. You can have a slam dunk, and sorry about that. You can have a slam dunk and not have your jury see it the same way. You just don't know. It's easier to guess what a judge is going to do with the case than what a jury is. And yeah, I think right now we've got so many new factors that have been thrown into the mix that have never been part of the mix before, that it is really a guessing game, more than normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's also why everyone has been more interested in mediation. You can get things resolved faster. You have a greater level of control. And, mediation's about compromise. So it means that if you're successful, everybody's going to be a little bit unhappy. Somebody's going to have paid more than they thought maybe they had to pay, and somebody's going to have gotten less than they thought maybe they were entitled to. And there are a lot of reasons why that makes more sense now than ever. And I would say, as far as attorney performance, if you're an insurance company and your attorneys are not talking to you about ways to resolve things, that's a problem. That's a red flag. That not every case is suitable for mediation, and there may be different times where mediation makes sense, but these are discussions that you should be having with your attorneys. You should be figuring out what makes sense for an individual case, and also understanding that, particularly if you're talking about coverage in bad faith litigation, that every case is a little bit different, and that you can't predict as much, how people are going to respond to for similar auto accidents. You can have a pretty good guess. Covered cases are different. And oftentimes, like I was saying, a lot of my cases are decided on summary judgment, which is a huge amount of work goes into writing those briefs. And then you have maybe a half-hour oral argument, maybe more if the judge lets you. And that's your trial. So insurance companies shouldn't skimp on having a really good brief and having somebody who can present something well to the judge, because the whole case could be resolved at a summary judgment stage, and then you don't have to go to trial. And trials are expensive and long, and we don't know when they're going to happen. So that's what I would say, to be having those discussions with your attorneys. And if it seems like your attorneys are not able to have those discussions and look at the pros and cons for the company, then they need to look somewhere else, because those issues there are always going to be these issues. Another thing that's hard about coverage litigation is policies are pretty standard. You run across manuscript policies or endorsements here and there, but for the most part, everybody uses standard forms. And what that means is, if you litigate and lose on your standard form in case 1, it's going to come up in case 2 and 10 and 100. That also means if you're litigating with another insurance company, say you're arguing about who gets to pay what of a judgment against a common insured, then you may want to try and settle that case, because if the decision goes in your favor on that one case, you may be in the other position in another 500 cases. And is that law really going to help you? So these are all issues that ought to be being discussed, because they're going to come up over and over again. It's not the same as representing, an individual that's the defendant in a auto case, because presumably they're not going to have 10 more of the same auto case. But the insurance company is likely to have issues with the same language and arguably similar facts in even other states, because they don't usually vary too much in a lot of these policies.
Do you think there'll be a increase in mediation? Do you think that will be a tool that you can use to prevent and mitigate things going to trial? Do you feel like there's going to push?
I think there already has been. And one thing that we're seeing is more push by the courts to get things into mediation, because the courts recognize that trials are not happening, at least in a familiar way, anytime soon. So the Massachusetts state courts have provided mediators. I know that a number of the mediators that I've worked with, and one of my partners does a lot of mediation, have been extremely busy, and rightfully so. It's been the perfect time to do it. We've now figured out how to do it remotely, and if it's a case that the parties are willing to look at and do on a digital basis, it's worth the time to attempt it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
In most cases.
Can things around mediation and arbitration, can that be put into insurance policies? Does that break any sort of insurance regulation in terms of rights of the policyholder. So and where I'm going with this, Laura, is can can we preempt this a little bit and add that to the policy ahead of time to kind of make it almost more likely than not that it would go to mediation or arbitration before it has the potential to get messy?
Well, first of all, let me distinguish between arbitration and mediation. So mediation is essentially a voluntary, we'll go in and discuss trying to come to a compromise amongst the parties. Arbitration, on the other hand, is essentially a private court action, for lack of a better word. It's binding on the parties. It generally has either one or a panel of usually lawyers that are the judges, functionally the arbitrators, and they're presented with evidence, usually in a less formal manner than a trial, but very similar to a trial. And they make a decision that's then binding on the parties. And generally with an arbitration, you waive your right of appeal. So if you're in arbitration, that's it. Win, lose, or draw, you are done and you can't go back to the courts. That can be required, and we see it all the time in, like our cell phone contracts and any other almost every contract we enter into as consumers will have an arbitration clause. You don't tend to see them in insurance policies, and I think there probably would be some pushback on that. But the one exception, and it's not really arbitration, but it's similar, is the appraisal process. Or in Massachusetts, we call it reference, because of course we're a little bit weird. But basically that is on a first party property claim. If there's a disagreement as to the value of whatever the thing is, then it goes to an appraisal process, which is sort of similar to an arbitration. It's usually a 3-person panel. Each side chooses one appraiser, and then the 2 appraisers choose the third, who's called the referee. And they are presented with evidence about the value of whatever it is. It could be, a vehicle, it could be a house. We're seeing a lot more personal property appraisals in the last few years than we ever did before. But then you determine the value of that, and that's separate from coverage. So oftentimes we have appraisal processes that are running parallel with coverage issues. So that because you can figure out the value of the item while still disputing whether there's coverage or not, even litigating whether there's coverage or not. And once that determination is made, you have the valuation as determined by the appraisal, and you can move forward.
Yeah. So is it, as a mitigative feature, are you expecting to see more of these?
I've been seeing a lot more mediations in the last year. I think the real question will be, once the courts are back in full operation and start to catch up, will we continue to see more? I think we might. I think that we've seen some of the values of it. There's been a lot of mediation though in the past. Maybe the individuals involved, like the insureds or the plaintiffs, will see more value to it, having been through more of it in the COVID period. But we certainly have seen more. The mediators have pivoted very well to digital, and I give them a huge amount of credit, because I was very dubious at the beginning, and I would continue to do it. I could see it being a less expensive endeavor. For example, if you have a situation where you've got 10 or 15 parties, and you would have people that were flying from various different parts of the country or even the world to go to a mediation, it would be a lot less expensive to get everyone together on a digital platform. And if it fails, you still haven't put as much money into it as you would bringing everybody, and you can always continue on with your case. So I think we'll see more of it. A lot of cases, like I see a lot of other insurance cases, which is disputes between 2 insurance companies as to their obligations with regard to a particular claim or loss. And those, it's everybody's job to deal with it. You don't have a situation where you have a plaintiff who's personally involved in the same way. And those kind of cases are perfect for a digital mediation. And I think, we can expect to see more of those. Uh, we'll see if I'm right, but that's my guess.
Yeah, no, it's part of the reason why I asked is because it seems like it makes sense that the courts will be choked up for a considerable period of time. I think it almost seems sensible, reasonable that people will get comfortable with it, right? It'll become more normal, and I think more they'll be more accepting of it. And it gets to where we started this. When you started your description of yourself, you said part of your job was to minimize litigation. That fits right in, right? Like, how can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm of the belief that we try to prevent and mitigate stuff before we go full force into it.
Absolutely.
And how can that be done from a litigation standpoint? What are some of the communicative efforts that you make, some of the tools, techniques, to try to get things resolved faster before they get bloody?
Well, first of all, I think that you start even before that back with best practices and
Okay.
make sure that those claim notes are something that the person typing them on their computer would be happy to testify in front of the CEO of their company and the plaintiff about, because that could happen. Um, and and just to use sort of a general reasonableness standard on, if someone were reading this, what would they think? And if someone were looking back over this case, could I explain how this claim, was handled and why, ABC happened? Um, if there's a 60-day delay on something, why is that? Is there a reason? If there's a reason, can you articulate the reason? Because there may be a great reason. Um, but if you can't put that out there, or if it's not shown in your claim file, that's a problem. And it's not one that you can't overcome. But if you don't have to overcome it, that's better.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and then second, I would say a lot of, like Massachusetts, for example, on a bad faith claim, in most cases, you have to do a demand letter. So either the insured or the plaintiff has to send a letter to the insurance company outlining, the terrible things the insurance company did. They should take these letters seriously. The letters should be responded to. And if the case is one where, something wasn't handled well, then try and get it resolved quickly before it goes into litigation. Because if you're going to have to pay some money in the end, you're better off paying probably less in the beginning, and then not having to pay for the cost of the litigation, the potential for bad public relations coming out of it. There are a lot of possibilities. I would also say get a lawyer involved, because we see a lot of these where either they don't respond to the letter or the response to the letter is not optimal. And you don't want to lose rights or characterize a case in a way from the very beginning that hurts you later. I also, I write a lot of these letters, and I always write them with the idea that I'm the big bad insurance company, and that's how I'm going to be perceived.
Hmm.
So I need to be super nice about everything, and I need to explain everything. So I always tell the story. This is my opportunity to tell the story from the insurance company perspective. And these letters in Massachusetts are going to go before the judge or jury, depending on what the plaintiff decides to do. So take that opportunity, tell your story, and tell it like a story, because insurance is not the most exciting stuff for most people. But the claims can be interesting. So tell the story and tell it from your perspective. And do it nicely. And remember, again, anything that you communicate could be shown later to a judge or a jury. So write it like that. Um,
Yeah. It I think we recently broadcast an episode where we talked about claims, and we talked about from a claims professional standpoint, we talked about like there's so much outsourcing of adjustments, adjustment services and things like that. And I'm seeing like this dichotomy or potential conundrum with that. There's the potential to do more outsourcing, which means you're losing a little bit of the control in how you want that claim potentially handled. But there's this wave of technology that's coming in where you should be able to resolve a lot of this stuff and keep track of it, like measure things. There are computer software that should tell you like this claim is at this stage and here are the ones you need to worry about. Like that technology exists. And but it's from what you're describing, I can see how you want to balance costs around that. So there's going to be that outsourcing pressure is going to continue to exist to balance the cost, but it could be offset with some technology. But it still gets back to some just basic things about like how you're treating the customer, how you're documenting that kind of stuff. But it in some ways, I want to kind of summarize what you're saying. A lot of this is preventable, right? Like if you just kind of grab the bull by the horns. And do you think there are like cultural issues around that? And I mean like business cultural issues of how this making like to make it preventable, right, to do these things. Is culture kind of like a driving factor, or organizations that sort of demand that, hey, we want the policyholder to be treated with respect, we want to do all the right things, and we demand of the technology and the outsourcing that you do this, versus other companies that just might not have it in their DNA, and it's more of like just get it done, just quick.
I think the communication piece with the insureds is key, and that keeping them informed and treating them well will minimize litigation, because if whether it's a claimant or a policyholder feels that they're being treated fairly, they're much less likely to bring a claim. And they're less likely to seek out a lawyer to see if they have a claim to bring. So I think that's so important. I also think with all the technology that it's very important to sort of harness it properly, that there has to be a human side of it, whether that's communicating the information to the insured, having a single person who takes in all of that data to address a particular claim, to make sure that the right and left hand know what's going on is key. Because all that's going to be in the claim file. And when it lands on my desk and I'm looking at the claim file, I'm going to be like, well, there's all this data over here, but no one did anything with it. And then you turned around and said that the claim was worth X, or that there was no damage for some portion that you actually have data in your file. I mean, those are the nightmares.
Yeah.
And those are the bad faith claims that can get ugly. So again, best practices, make sure that you know what information you have and how it fits with the claim, and that you act accordingly.
Yeah. I want to ask one final question to respect your time, on social inflation. Just the concern that um, jury awards are just going to get out of hand. Do you think this is a trend, or do you think this is just part of the cycle?
Well, we're certainly trending up. I would say the biggest driver of social inflation has been nuclear verdicts. And nuclear verdicts, when I say that, I mean, I think they have a dollar sign attached to them, but essentially I view a nuclear verdict as one where the damages awarded by a jury greatly exceed the information and evidence put forth. So the $1 million stub toe sort of scenario. And a number of plaintiffs' lawyers have done really well. There's this, I don't know, program for plaintiffs' attorneys called the reptile theory, which I could talk to you for another hour about, but it's done well with juries, and defense attorneys are doing better with counteracting it. So hopefully we're going to see some diminish, but with these big verdicts and with the internet and everybody, having all this information, people think that these numbers are more, I don't know, normal. So there's been a normalization of them, which has resulted in this idea of jury verdicts being more than sort of reality. So that when a juror is sitting in the box, they may be viewing things differently. And I suspect it's probably going to continue because the internet's certainly not going away. And if anything, over the last year, we've all been more attached to, constant information than ever before. So that's not going to change. I'm hopeful that defense attorneys will continue to improve their ability to counteract these claims. We've got a lot of case law that's addressing them. I drafted an amicus brief against the reptile theory in Massachusetts, and we're waiting on the decision from the SJC, our Supreme Court, on that to basically we suggested to the court that there were a number of evidentiary issues that were handled appropriately by the trial judge, and then the appeals court flipped it. So I think we're going to see some changes. The law tends to be slow to respond to things, and as a result, the plaintiffs have made a lot of hay in the interim. So if we can get some control on that, then things may start to move down. But also, some of the big cases have been like, it's against big corporations, and some of those corporations have done really well during COVID. Like the pharmaceutical industry, for example, has definitely, in most people's view, improved a lot. At least, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J are looking pretty good. So that could change things too. And I've got a good friend who's a jury consultant and works with companies on how to present to juries so as to not trigger some of these, big bad corporation feelings, which is true with insurance companies too. And a lot of the stuff about the business interruption is this feeling that insurance companies have an unlimited amount of money, which of course is not true. And in many lines of business, the only thing that's kept them afloat is the stock market with the premium dollars. So, so it's going to be interesting. I think people also don't quite realize that the nuclear verdicts are causing their premiums to increase. That connection is too, I guess, disjointed for people to understand.
Someone else's problem.
Yeah.
Well, the law may move slow, but this hour flew by, and we didn't even touch Florida. And you brought up reptile theory, which I'm gonna go have to research now. So
look at my post on LinkedIn. I did a post on it.
Okay. I will add that to the show notes. So if you're listening to this, go ahead. You can connect with Laura. I'll put all of her information as well, and link to all of that. But the hour did truly fly by, and you have a nice knack of taking something that's kind of like in insurance, probably something that's not as exciting as we think it is, but making it exciting to someone that you're talking to. So you have a nice knack of doing that, and I appreciate you.
Well, one thing I try and do through my LinkedIn posts is to make insurance understandable, approachable, and even interesting. Also just to make people realize that it's involved in everything. So like yesterday, I posted about the Suez Canal and all of the different impacts that was going to have. And I'm certain we didn't, hit all of them, but certainly all those containers on that ship are delayed, all of the hundreds of ships that are continuing to be delayed, or the additional exposure for the ones that went around Africa instead of waiting.
Oh, without a doubt. Like I have a reinsurance friend who's in marine and cargo, and I said, "This is going to affect you?" He's like, "Yes, of course." He's like,
Yeah,
the only thing I can cross my fingers over is we have $1 million retentions, so we might be able to escape, but someone's someone's definitively going to be paying stuff out, and he thinks he might as well, and that's way up on
and
the reinsurance side. So
yeah,
working its way.
and
Uh,
there's some limitations on that because it's admiralty, and the liability exposure is more limited in admiralty than it is in, say, tort law in the United States. So it's got a lot of different twists and turns. But yeah, so another.
I say we pause the recording and restart it and just go right into the Suez Canal and talk for another hour. You have that knack. So
Well, thank you.
I appreciate that, and thank you so much.
All right, this has been great.
Thanks.